Hi, I'm Kelly Montgomery with Third Eye Brewing here in Cincinnati, Ohio, and here's your craft beer and brewing tip of the week. We use a lot of different yeasts at Third Eye. We brew a lot of different styles. We play around with a lot of different yeasts. Classic milk style, though, is one of those yeasts that we really don't want a yeast that's full of flavor. We really just want something neutral. So this is perfect where, you're on a classic milk style, low ABV, Cephal 05. We don't use that as much, but we'll use something equivalent in liquid form. But just your basic normal yeast, let the malt profile that you spend all that time building up, all those complexities, the grains and flavors, let that do all the talking for the beer. We don't use the yeast a whole lot for that, just something neutral. It's a little bit different now as we scale up to the Imperial, let's just say the chocolate stout. We don't use dry yeast on more of the bigger beers. I know a lot of you out there have had success brewing just fine with a dry yeast on a big beer. We found in our experience with our equipment, the yeast seems to just kind of quit too early for us. It just seems like it's getting tired. We try to, on the big Imperial stouts, we'll make sure it's second, third generation. It was originally a liquid yeast. We're not scared of over pitching on this beer. We want to over oxygenate. We want to make sure we're over oxygenating as the beer's going into the fermenter. And we want to make sure that we have a lot of yeast. We might start at 1.14, get down to that 1060. That is some tired yeast. So we might, for a 30 barrel batch, we're using a couple 100 pounds of yeast slurry. We're using a ton of yeast. If you ever had a big stout and you can taste a lot of alcohol, I think doing that over pitching helps you smooth that out, kind of hides the high alcohol level. But we will over pitch and we'll use just your basic generic kind of West Coast Chico yeast strain for our big stouts. So for classic milk style, I mentioned dry yeast. We use that occasionally and that's totally fine on the smaller beer. We like to ferment our dry yeast if we're using them a little bit lighter. We feel they just pick up a little bit extra flavor than the liquid form. Might ferment those around 65, 66 on a little bit lower end. If we're using this liquid version, the same thing. We're usually going about 67, 68. I'm on the Imperial. We might be trying to tame down some of that crazy fermentation so we're not finding a big mess in the morning when we come in. We might start that off a little bit slower, maybe start that off and, like we said, big, giant liquid pitch, over pitched. We might start that at 64, 65 and ramp that up to 67, 68 as we go, kind of control that fermentation a little bit. Typical fermentation time on our classic milk stouts, we can usually do grain to glass. We'll do those in about 2.5 weeks. Find they ferment out pretty quick. Once we get the diacetyl, these things are pretty fast beers. We don't have to give them a lot of time to get everything we're looking for. The Imperial version, on the other hand, that could be a 3 or 4 week process. It's probably one of the more inconsistent beers that we brew in the brewery with the high ABV level. It's not as linear as far as when it's going to be done. With that one, we really have to let the beer decide and tell us when it's done. It's got a mind of its own. So that's usually in that 3.5 weeks, sometimes even 4 weeks for one of our big stouts, just to make sure everything's melding together, all the flavors are where we want them. For these big Imperial stouts, we really have to plan in advance. It's not something that we can just decide to brew and brew it the next week. We have to plan our yeast strategy a little bit with these, because if we were to actually buy the amount of yeast that we would need from a yeast manufacturer, it'd be 5 times the regular cost or 4 times, whatever the number is than our regular classic milk stout. So we plan these in advance so that we're going to use a low ABV beer. It's perfect if we happen to be brewing our higher purpose low ABV milk stout. That one's perfect, doesn't always work like that. But you want to use a low ABV beer, something not hoppy, and we want to build up those yeast cells and we want to have a bunch of it. So we'll usually plan whatever yeast we're going to be using for our Imperial stout. We're going to brew a small beer with it. I like to time it about 2 weeks before we brew the big beer. And that gives it plenty enough time for that yeast to flocculate out. That yeast is raring to go and it's ready to do work as soon as it hits the tank. So that's what we're shooting for, the small beer, and using that yeast to go into the big beer. That's also a great way to save money because buying a pitch for one of these big beers wouldn't be very cost effective. To learn more about brewing award-winning flavorful stouts, click the link below.